this is the site of Mr. Freeman's farm, and we believe that his farmhouse was right in this area. He had an old barn somewhere, another outbuildings. Mr. Freeman was a loyalist and cast his lot with General Burgoyne and was serving as part of the British Army that was here. And unfortunately, he chose the wrong side, so after the battles, he got to go to Canada as a loyalist. His property was confiscated, and he was just out of luck. Unlike the Nielsen's up at Stop 2. You see, he sited his farm up on this little rise, and let's keep in mind now we're back to September 19th. We're still now talking about the first battle, and I want to kind of recite again how that came to pass. The river is over here on the east. The British camp is up here in this direction on the river, and the British were swarming all over this area with their troops bivouacked in this area and going back toward the wheat field at Stop 5. That's up in that direction. The British are making their move west to try to flank the Americans. If you recall that, it looks on the map like this. We are now here, and the British are making their move this way with 2/3 of their army, 1/3 on the river floodplain, and they're coming through a road that is just on the other side of those trees, and their pickets come out here to see what's going on. They're reconnaissance, and what's going on at that point is the American pickets, who are a specialized rifle regiment under Daniel Morgan, they are rummaging around the farm to see if anybody's in the house or in the barn, or if there's any trouble brewing here. And they encounter the British here. British come out, Morgan's riflemen engage them, and that begins this battle, this back and forth battle that lasts all day. The movement west is stopped because they don't want to separate that part of the army from the one that is becoming engaged here. The Americans are coming out of the woods at that tree line. This is a very long, you see the red top stakes here. This is the fortification that Burgoyne built during the 18 days on the site of the Freeman farm. It's long and skinny, like a paperclip in essence. You can see it's very close here. Goes down about 500 yards that way. 8 cannon in here, garrisoned with 1,200 troops. It's a significant fortification. The battle starts here, and it moves back and forth in this clear area with the American troops coming from the south out of that tree line, the British pushing the Americans back, the Americans pushing this way, and it goes back and forth for the entire day. And it is a killing ground. Again, the British lose 600 and the Americans only 300. They didn't know that right away until all of the returns came in, but when the British found out how effective the Americans were in confrontational battle, they gained a little bit more respect and a little less arrogance toward the Americans. At the end of the day, some of the troops from the river operation come up and they essentially scatter the Americans, who go back to camp, and the British array themselves in the northern part of the battlefield. Stop 5 is in no man's land, where we just were at. But this is clearly British territory. You with me so far? Okay. Let me digress just a little bit and talk about riflemen versus musketeers. The typical infantry soldier in the 1700s was firing a smooth bore musket, muzzle loading, armed with generally a prepared paper cartridge of powder goes down the muzzle. A ball is tamped down on top of that charge, and it's ignited by a flint spark. And after a shot, it has to be reloaded, and that takes a little bit of time. And soldiers were trained to do this by muscle memory. And a good soldier with a good musket could maybe get off 4, maybe 5 shots in a minute, but that's pretty extraordinary and not typical of battle situations. And typically what soldiers did was they would array themselves in a line, usually with 2 ranks. And the first line would fire on command. This was all very ritualized, so that you fired when the sergeant said fire. You put out a wall of lead to the other guys who are doing the same thing back at you, most likely. The first line comes back, they step back, they reload their weapons. The second line, already loaded, comes up, they do the same thing. Maybe there's a third line, but that was the idea behind traditional infantry rifle tactics, or not rifle tactics, but infantry tactics. Now, by the time of our battles here, both sides had become aware that formalized rank firing like that was not always possible in terrain like this, or in maneuver operations. And they did that when they could, when it was reasonable to do it, because aiming a smoothbore musket is not a precise event. You just want a wall of lead going out to those guys. And what you want to do is cripple as many of them as you can, do that 2 or 3 times, hope to break their cohesion, and then charge them with a bayonet. That was the main British tactic. They called the bayonet the British weapon, a terror weapon, in effect. Operationally, what happens is, if you could, you would fire en masse, and then folks would dissolve to the nearest tree trunk or fence post and fire at will.
How far do those muskets go? I have no idea.
They would fire with some accuracy to about 100 yards, and I'm not good at measuring these things, but do you have any idea? Can you point out 100 yards for us?
Well, probably from those trees there to the trees behind you.
Okay.
About
That'll
that.
give you an idea,
Yeah.
with some accuracy. Now let's talk about riflemen just for a minute. Riflemen fired rifles. They were muskets, muzzle loading weapons, but their barrels, the inside of their barrels, were grooved with a spiral groove, and that is called rifling, and that gives the ball, the projectile, a spin, and that spin gives it more accuracy and more range than a smoothbore musket. The fit of the ball inside a smoothbore was always a little loose, and that was one of the reasons it did not have the stopping power or the range or the accuracy of the rifle.
So the British had the less accurate musket.
Yes, the British and most of the Americans.
Oh, and
Most of the Americans also had smoothbore muskets. That was the typical weapon. Morgan's regiment, about 400 troops, were specifically riflemen. They came from the western part of Virginia and Maryland and the central states. And these were personal weapons. They were hunting weapons. That technology was just emerging at this time. And they were brought together by Washington under Morgan's command. And they were sent up here because they were so versatile. They were the point troops, the reconnaissance troops for the American Army, and they were the ones that were down here and first engaged the British pickets. Now the problem with rifles is that, number one, they did not mount a bayonet, so that after you fired and you're reloading, you have nothing to protect yourself with. At least if you're a smoothbore musket, you've got a bayonet and you can defend yourself if the other guys are getting too close. And number two, it took them longer to reload typically than the musket. So what General Gates did was attach to the rifle regiment a regiment of light infantry firing muskets, and their task was to protect the riflemen in their engagement of the enemy. And that was under Major Dearborn. His regiment was combined with Morgan's, and they had the riflemen and the protective regiment of musketeers. Okay, so we have the riflemen. After things start getting disorganized and the engagement is developing, the riflemen are scattered, and unfortunately their protection, Major Dearborn's unit, takes a wrong turn on the road coming up from the south, and he winds up over here. So the strategy was good, but the execution was not good. As it turns out, the riflemen occupy this wood line over here. There's a ravine there, and they place themselves on the far side of that ravine, and they are firing into the flanks of the British. The British are aiming at the Americans over here, and the riflemen are firing into theirs. They're firing at them from the side. The riflemen typically would like to aim at officers. Officers generally were on horses. They were very clear targets. And they also would aim at the artillerists. The artillerists were the scientists of the battlefield. They knew how to charge those cannon, how much powder to put in, how to aim them. They had some sense of trigonometry and geometry and so forth. So if you pop off the artillerists, those cannon become fairly useless, and that was pretty much what they were doing. They were creating a lot of havoc for the British as the British were advancing toward the Americans in the south here. Okay, questions? Yes, ma'am.
How many men operate a cannon like that? How does that work?
Typically somewhere around a dozen at full strength.